So today we're going to start the American Civil War, and it is probably one of the most significant events in American history because it really split our country down the center between those who wanted more of a powerful central government versus those who wanted more powerful state governments. In the Civil War, of course, the North and the South fought each other, and one of the big reasons was slavery. But along with slavery, there's many other reasons that you're going to learn over the course of the next week or week and a half. When you're looking at any of the pictures that are coming in the following slides, just remember that when you see the blue is always the North, and whenever you see the gray is always the South. And you can see one of the big things is the two flags. We have the battle flag of the South over on the right. And a lot of people think that this was actually the flag of the Confederacy, and it wasn't actually the flag, but it was the battle flag. Over on the left, we have the United States flag, which at the time also came to represent the Northern troops. Okay. So we're going to start with some reading, and then we're going to look at some pictures and then continue on with the reading. But the reading that you have today is an overview of the American Civil War. And as we're reading through, you'll underline a few parts that I want you to remember, and that'll also help you on the quiz. And I'm going to highlight them on my screen so you know what to be highlighting. It's really important to be listening to some of the details because in 2 weeks, we'll have our test on the Civil War. So let's start with our overview. The Civil War is the central event in Americans' historical consciousness. While the Revolution of 1776 to 1783 created the United States, the Civil War of 1861 to 1865 determined what kind of nation it would be. The war resolved two fundamental questions left unresolved by the Revolution: whether the United States was to be a dissolvable confederation of sovereign states or an indivisible nation with a sovereign national government, and whether this nation, born of a declaration that all men were created with an equal right to liberty, would continue to exist as the largest slaveholding country in the world. We want to make sure that we highlight and you'll underline that we were, at the time, the largest slaveholding country in the world. And most of those slaves, although not all, but most of them did live in the South because of the need for tobacco and cotton farming. Northern victory in the war preserved the United States as one nation and ended the institution of slavery that had divided the country from its beginning. But these achievements came at the cost of 625,000 lives. So you'll want to underline 625,000 lives, which was nearly as many American soldiers as those who died in all other wars in which this country has fought combined. That includes World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and the Revolutionary War. The American Civil War was the largest and most destructive conflict in the Western world between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the onset of World War I in 1914. So this was a major event in American history, but it also really defined us as a nation. Now let's take a moment to look at some pictures that relate to the beginning of the Civil War and some people that you obviously will have to know in order to understand what was going on between the North and the South during the Civil War period. So the first picture we're going to look at is here with the two leaders of the two parts of the nation during the Civil War. Most of you have probably at least seen Lincoln, who is on the left, and he's also on your reading. But he was the president of the USA, and when he was elected, they say that Lincoln's election really set off everyone to want to separate or secede in the South. So Lincoln's election really caused that. On your paper, because you might not know who was the leader of the South, I do want you to write somewhere on your paper that Jefferson Davis, who is in the image on the right, was the leader of the Confederate States of America, which we shortened to CSA, during the Revolutionary War. So he was the one that was leading all of the states that wanted to succeed down in the South. So remember, Lincoln is in the North and Davis is in the South. And these were the two presidents, although there were other people that became famous, such as Robert E. Lee, who is one of our vocabulary words, and Stonewall Jackson and Ulysses S. Grant. So let's look back at our reading and continue on to understand a little bit more of what was going on during the Civil War. The Civil War started because of uncompromising differences between the free and slave states over the power of the national government to prohibit slavery in the territories that had not yet become states. So I want you to underline national government to prohibit slavery in the territories that had not yet become states, So it wasn't the fact that there was slavery already in the South. It was that as more and more states started to join the Union or the United States, a lot of people in the North wanted them to be free, and a lot of people in the South wanted them to be slave states. So it's important to note, and I want you to write this on your paper, that the major thing was it was over uncharted territories. And I use uncharted as just a way to describe territories that hadn't been taken over. So let's continue. When Abraham Lincoln won election in 1860, so again, election in 1860, as the first Republican president on a platform pledging to keep slavery out of the territories, 7 slave states in the Deep South seceded and formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. This incoming Lincoln administration and most of the Northern people refused to recognize the legitimacy of secession. They feared that it would discredit democracy and create a fatal precedent that would eventually fragment the no longer United States into several small, squabbling countries. In this last section, one of the main things that I want you to note is that in this whole part where it says the incoming Lincoln administration refused to recognize legitimacy of secession, really just means that the North didn't accept the CSA as separate. So if you're in the South, you can understand why some Southerners who really wanted to maintain this idea of secession started to get upset with the overreach of the North. So now we have the North and South really separating. And again, this is why this election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 is really said to start the Civil War. Although it starts the following year in 1861, this was really the key point that set it off. So continuing on with the reading, we're going to read these next 2 paragraphs, take a few notes, and then we will look at some more pictures that connect to the Civil War. The event that triggered war came at Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay on April 12, 1861. Claiming this United States fort as their own, the Confederate Army on that day opened fire on the Federal garrison and forced it to lower the American flag and surrender. Lincoln called out the militia to suppress this insurrection. 4 more slave states seceded and joined the Confederacy. By the end of 1861, nearly a million armed men confronted each other along a line stretching 1,200 miles from Virginia to Missouri. Several battles had already taken place near Manassas Junction in Virginia, in the mountains of West Virginia, where Union victories paved the way for creation of the new state of West Virginia. At Wilson's Creek in Missouri, at Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, and at Port Royal in South Carolina, where the Union Navy established a base for a blockade to shut off the Confederacy's access to the outside world. So really quickly, I just want you to underline the part where it says, in the mountains of West Virginia, where Union victories paved a way for the creation of the new state of West Virginia. And then just put a little note off to the side that West Virginia, you can just put W.VA, was created because of the Civil War. So West Virginia only separated from Virginia because they wanted that area to be slave-free. So it wasn't a state on its own. This was the time that it was created. Continuing on. But the real fighting began in 1862. Huge battles like Shiloh in Tennessee, Gaines Mill, Second Manassas, and Fredericksburg in Virginia, and Antietam in Maryland foreshadowed even bigger campaigns and battles in subsequent years, from Gettysburg in Pennsylvania to Vicksburg on the Mississippi to Chickamauga and Atlanta in Georgia. By 1864, the original Northern goal of a limited war to restore the Union had given way to a new strategy of total war to destroy the Old South and its basic institution of slavery, and to give the restored Union a new birth of freedom, as President Lincoln put it in his address at Gettysburg, to dedicate a cemetery for Union soldiers killed in the battle there. So what happens in 1864? The original Northern goal of a limited war ended, and they wanted a total war to destroy the Old South. So make sure you underline those two things. And then I just want you to put off to the side that the North basically wants to destroy the South at this point. They're upset because the South is starting to try and take more and more over and really separate this idea of one nation, which we learned about in the Revolutionary War. That's what everybody had fought together, was to create one nation. And now a lot of Northerners are seeing that the South is trying to undo this idea of one nation. So one of the first images we're going to look at is right here. And this is the Battle of Shiloh, which at the top of your paper, it does say that the Battle of Shiloh was one of the major battles that happened in 1862. And we can see kind of the chaos that these battles incurred. This image, of course, you can see in the back over here, the American battle flag, and you can faintly see, although you can't really tell it as clearly, that we have the Southern battle flag, the CSA battle flag, and here's the USA battle flag, which was also the American flag. So we have all of these soldiers in this image are laying here, and they're either hurt or dying, and we're also using, and I circle them here, these cannons, and we're using them basically against our own people. And this was being done on both sides. The next image that we're going to look at is one from Antietam. And Antietam was considered one of the most severe or most devastating battles in the Civil War. At one point, I've actually heard a fact that they said if you stepped onto the battlefield of Antietam after the battle was done, your foot would sink almost 1 foot into the ground, and that was basically sinking into blood. That there are so many dead bodies that had soaked the ground that you could step on there, and the mud wasn't because of water, the mud was because of blood. So this is an actual image from one of these battles, and this is actually specifically Antietam. So you can see a lot of the bodies that are lying there, but we also see that there are people over on this side that they're trying to kind of de-shadow. So our focus is on how many people have died in the war, but we see that there are men who are still standing there, and there's a few that did survive. We're going to continue on with the reading. So if you go back to your reading, we're down at the bottom of the second page where it starts for 3 long years. For 3 long years, from 1862 to 1865, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia staved off invasions and attacks by the Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by a series of ineffective generals, until Ulysses S. Grant came to Virginia from the Western Theater to become general in chief of all Union armies in 1864. After bloody battles at places with names like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg, Grant finally brought Lee to bay at Appomattox in April 1865. So on this page we have, or in this paragraph, we have two big things that I want you to note. So I want you to make sure that you block off Robert E. Lee and that you block off or underline Ulysses S. Grant. Right above it or right below that paragraph, you have some space. So make sure that you note in that space that the North ended up being led by Grant. It was not the whole time that they were led. As it says, they were commanded by a series of ineffective generals until Grant. And then in the South, they had Robert E. Lee, and they also had another general named Stonewall Jackson. A lot of the leaders in the South were strong military leaders because in Virginia, there is West Point Academy, and West Point still produces some of the best or most effective leaders of the military. So we have Lee and Jackson in the South, Grant in the North. And Grant, once he finally came in 1864, he was the one that really helped ensure that the North was going to win, because at the time it was starting to seem like the South was going to win. So let's take a moment and actually look at a picture of these two generals. In this image, we can see over on the left-hand side, we have Lee, and on the right-hand side, we have Grant, and we can tell which side they are on because of the flag that's attached to them. Yes, there are actual images of both Lee and Grant, but this is one of the good ones to really ensure that you remember Lee was in the South and Grant was in the North. So you really need to remember Lee was in the South, Grant was in the North. So make sure that you had written that down on your paper. So continuing on with the reading, it starts actually at the bottom of the second page, but I have the third page up on the slide. But it starts with, in the meantime, Union armies and river fleets in the theater of war, comprising the slave states west of the Appalachian Mountain chain, won a long series of victories over Confederate armies commanded by hapless or unlucky Confederate generals. In 1864 to 1865, General William Tecumseh Sherman led his army deep into the Confederate heartland of Georgia and South Carolina, destroying their economic infrastructure, while General George Thomas virtually destroyed the Confederacy's Army of Tennessee at the Battle of Nashville. By the spring of 1865, all the principal Confederate armies surrendered, and when Union cavalry captured the fleeing Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Georgia on March 10, 1865, resistance collapsed and the war ended. The long, painful process of rebuilding a united nation free of slavery began. On this page, there's two major things that I want you to note. The first one starts with this guy, William Tecumseh Sherman. And Sherman was, as it says, one of the generals for the North. And Sherman had a policy, and this is what I want you to write down on your paper, called scorched earth. And this wasn't new to military, or to a military conflict, but it was the first time it was used in the U.S. And basically the scorched earth policy is just a slash and burn policy, which means you slash all the crops, you take what you can, and you burn the rest. So he was pretty severe when he went through on his march to the sea as he went down. But At this time, you have to remember that the North wanted to win because of the secessionist policies of the South, and this was one of the major ways that he could win. Additionally, if you're slashing and burning crops, if you do recall, the South, especially the Southern colonies during the Revolutionary War, their whole culture relied on crops. So if you're taking this away, you're basically taking the Southern culture away. The second thing to note on this page is Appomattox Courthouse. So this is Appomattox Courthouse. Over on the right, we have Grant. And over on the left, signing conceit or defeat is Lee. So on your paper, write Appomattox, or you can circle it in your writing. And this is where Civil War ended. So we have all of these major areas where the Civil War was taking place, and Appomattox was finally where the Civil War comes to an end. So over the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at some of the famous battles and some of the timelines that led to basically the destruction of the United States and what's going to come afterwards, which is Reconstruction, which leads us into the 1900s. And the reason that the Civil War, I really am going to emphasize that you know the Civil War, is because our country now is really split almost along these same lines that happened during the Civil War. The North, especially the Northeast, really wanted kind of a more manufacturing culture, whereas the South wanted more of the independent states' rights culture. And that's the same way it is now. A lot of Northeastern, you think of the big cities, you generally think of New York, you think of Boston. Those are where like those major hubs are. Whereas in the South, you think of a lot more agriculture. So this is the end of our intro into the Civil War. The next thing you're going to be looking at is the pre-1860 timeline. A lot of the stuff that leads up to the Civil War were based on those compromises over fugitive slaves, such as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, that occurred before President Lincoln was elected. President Lincoln's election is actually what makes the war happen. So all of these things are going to end up building up to it. So the next video you'll watch is Disunion Timeline, and you'll create your own timeline so you know which compromises and which laws really came into place that affected or started the Civil War.